So that last video cut off kind of abruptly, but we're just going to pick right back up. So we're looking at the IMRD outline, and we're going to take the ideas from this and plug them into our writing the results and discussion instructions, kind of reviewing what we know from the papers. And actually, we did an exercise like this on Tuesday when we had to identify which box was, or which set of steps was discussion and which set of steps was results. So let's copy the results first. Just copy those in there so we can kind of, oops, that's not what I want to do. I'm going to change some of this formatting so that it matches up with the rest of it. And let's go ahead and we're going to copy the description of the results. Sorry, of the discussion section. Right, here we go. Okay, so right now we have a foundation in understanding what's going to be in the results section and what's going to be in the discussion section. And this kind of echoes what we know already. And at this point, I think we're mostly trying to figure out how are we going to write it. So I want to take a moment and kind of reflect on the chart that I showed at the beginning, which shows, okay, we're going from this information right here from the paper, from the exercise on Tuesday in class. We're going to use that to make a graph, and then we're going to write about that graph and what's in that graph. And then we're going to take what we've said about what we've written about that graph and sort of analyze it and discuss it a little bit more. So that lines up with what we have written down so far. So to learn a little bit more about how we're going to write it, what we're going to do is go ahead and look at sample paper 1 and sample paper 2. And look at both of them, look at their results and discussion sections, and then make some notes about what they do in there so that we can, go ahead and do this in our own papers. So I'm going to pull up, let's see, we've got sample paper 1 right here, and I'm just going to go on through to the results section. And the results section, so it starts right here. I recommend pulling out your own copy so you can kind of follow along. And go ahead and take a moment and just kind of skim through the whole section, see what you notice. Okay, so I hope you've gotten a chance to kind of look through that section. And what you can kind of see in the beginning is an introduction paragraph. So let's make a note about that. We start off with an introduction paragraph in the results section. And then a sentence to introduce the graph, and then some writing about the graph. So it describes what is in there and what's represented in the data visualization. Here it's a pie chart. So let's go ahead and make a note of that. So we've got an introduction paragraph, and then one of the body paragraphs is, let's see, this body paragraph is going to be an introduction, chart, and or graph, whatever kind of data visualization that you choose to use, and then description of the data. So, and if you've read it, you can see that it, like I said, it's basically just describing the numbers and the percentages. And the introduction at the beginning just kind of talks about, it integrates their hypothesis. So important finding out how much people who value CSR were being familiar at Tom, so it's just kind of integrating their hypothesis and then also giving the numbers for, and one of the breakdowns here is by gender. So one of the breakdowns for the demographics. So you can kind of see that's what they've done in the introduction paragraph. So I'm going to go back and make that note about the introduction that small amount of information about the number of participants and a breakdown of demographics. And another thing that they include is going to be the reference to the hypothesis. Actually, you know what? I take that back because it's the hypothesis is, kind of the answer they think to their questions. So I'm going to say it's a little bit of a reference to the goal of the study. So reference to the goal of the study. So we have this body paragraph. So the first body paragraph has this structure of introduction. There's a chart, graph, or table, and then a description of the data. Let's look and see if that pattern repeats itself. So take a moment, make sure, kind of go through, see if that pattern comes up with the rest of the writing. So as you can see, that pattern does continue, where there is an introduction sentence describing the question, and then there's a visual representation of the data, and then after that they describe what the data is. And you can see for the third example they do that again. So what you have here is that occurs 3 different times. So there's 3 body paragraphs where that happens. And one thing I want to think about is that you want to notice, like, is it meeting a lot of these criteria that we got from the IMRD outline? And it mostly does. One thing that I want to think about is going from more general results to more specific results. And I would say that the last question is a little more general than this, the second question. So I would put the first question, I think, is a good, are people familiar with Tom's CSR? I think that's a good first point to have. And then I would put then, people willing to pay more to benefit a child in need. So that's also kind of more general. And then specifically dialing in on kind of the Tom's, one for all, would you still help? Because that's really kind of being more specific. What's nice though is that all these questions are connected so that you can see a general connection between them, which will make it easier in the discussion section. Let's go ahead and I want to look at paper 2. So take a moment and read paper 2 and see if it uses this same kind of outline where there's an introduction paragraph and then 3 body paragraphs that are composed of an introduction, a chart, graph, table, and then a description of the data. So let's go and look at research paper number 2. And if you want, go ahead and take a moment and read through it and see what you find. Okay, so here we have something a little bit different where we do have this same kind of introduction paragraph, and then but when we have data, when there's a discussion about data, one thing that's different is there's no introduction sentence, and I actually think that's a weaker form. So I'm going to say this one has a weaker results section, but there's still something we can learn from it. One thing I wanted to point out is that the description of the data for the first graph does not match up with what is represented. So if you want, take a few minutes, you can see how it actually doesn't represent what is actually shown in the chart. You can see, and that can be confusing for your audience. So make sure what you're writing does match up. So I think, right here, if I'm looking at this first chart, it says the following chart shows the results of students eat from McDonald's. So that would actually be, I think, kind of a fine introduction sentence, and treating it as the title is a little bit strange because that's kind of long for a title. So what they could do is, find some shortened title like, number of students eating from McDonald's or something like that, like students eating at McDonald's, something just shorter than this whole sentence, and then make that what looks to be a title, make it into their introduction sentence. And then next, they've got this graph, which seems to be good, except again, I would include a sentence to have an introduction. And then they've got, but most of the other things are okay. Like, they've got the data and the numbers. They've got two colors representing the two different demographics. So that's okay. So what I would say is that they did use, here they use 2 paragraphs to write about it, where I think they should have just made it into 1 paragraph. So that's another bit of feedback. And then the last part, they don't show a graph. And I would have liked to have seen a graph, because as I'm reading it, it's a little bit hard to understand their ideas. So I would encourage you as much as possible, like including a graph, just because the description, while it's helpful and it shows you understand the data, it doesn't come across as easily. So I'm going to say that, looking at this, you can still, you can kind of learn from it, because you can kind of see where some of the weaknesses are and think about what to avoid when you're writing your own. So I'm going to use that to think about what we can learn from it. So make sure your descriptions of the graphs or charts are accurate. And I think, what were some of the other lessons? So make sure you include an introduction sentence. So right here, I'm just putting these lessons because I think that we got to see a pretty good example of a results section from paper number 2. So given that, I'm going to leave these instructions as what to use for how to write the results section. So right now we can even just take these. I wrote about it very generally, so I can use that in the next part of the worksheet, which will look a little bit different if you have the paper version, just because of how the different parts kind of, collide together and everything. So that means that we're going to go ahead, and we've got our directions right now for how to write the results section. So have an introduction paragraph with a small amount of information about the number of participants and a breakdown of demographics. Again, you don't have to go into super in depth, but maybe pick out, a breakdown of demographics that focus, that you bring up in your analysis. So that means, like, if you never bring up race, don't mention, it's probably not useful to bring up the race demographic. But if you bring up something like gender, then go ahead and mention that, or year. But make sure, I recommend bringing up the demographic that you end up looking at a little bit so that that way that information is available to your reader in a little more plain form. So there you go. We've got our directions for writing the results section. And next we're going to go ahead and go through and use the sample papers to learn about writing the discussion section.